Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's learning session, Forests on the Global Stage, organized by WWF Forest and Climate. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. My name is Emmeline Gasparini, and I am a Program Associate with the Forest and Climate team. Our presenter today is Josefina Brana-Varela, the Senior Director of WWF Forest and Climate. Next slide, please. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few logistics and some frequently asked questions. For those of you who have participated in previous sessions, this will sound familiar, and yes, today's presentation is being recorded, and you can find the recording within a few days on our YouTube channel. To get to the recording, simply go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate. There are two audio options. You can listen through your computer or dial in through the phone number that was provided in your registration email. It's important to note that if you experience audio difficulties while listening in through your computer, those are sometimes caused by having too many browser windows or programs open at once. So try closing some of them, which usually solves the issue, or you're always welcome to join by phone. And if you continue to have technical difficulties, please send me a message via the chat area or sometimes the question function, and I'll try to get you sorted out while Josefina is giving her presentation. Questions are absolutely welcome. You can send your questions anytime during the webinar using the toolbar on your screen, and we'll answer as many as possible during our allotted time. And if necessary, we can organize some follow-up questions after in written form. After the webinar, you'll receive a link in your follow-up email with additional forest and climate resources, including a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch a recording of the session once it goes live. So thank you again for joining us, and with that, we'll get started. Josefina, take it away. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Emmeline, and hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. So today's presentation is going to be about giving you the updates, the latest news on the forest and climate agenda, and I'm going to be focusing on two issues. One is the 18th meeting of the Green Climate Fund Board that happened in Cairo a few weeks ago, from September 30th to October 2nd. And then the second part of the presentation is going to be focusing on what is happening for COP23 in Bonn, soon to be held at the beginning of November. So with that, next slide, please. Let's start with the GCF updates. As I was mentioning, the Green Climate Fund had its 18th meeting of the board in Cairo a few weeks ago. And one thing that was in this agenda, among many others, and in particular review of proposals submitted, was the fact that the board needed to make a decision on how to operationalize results-based payments for REDD+. This issue has been under discussion in the GCF for 3 years now, and it comes from decade-long discussion or negotiations under the UNFCCC on REDD+ and how to deliver results-based payments for countries that can demonstrate results in terms of emissions reductions. So finally, in this meeting, after very intense days of negotiations, board members had the technical advisors there with them. They pretty much took 4 days to try to get into an understanding and a compromise decision on how they could operationalize all the UNFCCC decisions to build a program under the GCF to pay for results-based actions, in particular for REDD+. So, just as a context, the negotiations were not easy. There was a bit of polarization between developing and developed countries on what would be the terms for this program to work out, or what would be the specific rules. There was some pushback from developing countries with respect to having additional rules or rules that would go beyond the Warsaw Framework for REDD+. And in the other side, developed countries wanting to hello, sorry about that, some technical problems. Sorry, so as I was saying, negotiations were not very easy. It took them 4 days, 4 days for the technical advisors to get into an agreement. Polarizations were based on the need to have excuse me, to have further or additional rules on top of the ones the UNFCCC had already agreed, and as opposed to just sticking to the Warsaw Framework for REDD. So that there were many discussions and there was some polarization, but at the end, I think the decision shows some compromise. Let's talk more in detail about this decision. So next slide, please. So these are the highlights of the decision, and just for you to know, I think the great news is that the program is going to dedicate $500 million for this pilot program. This first, because it's the first request for proposals that the Green Climate Fund is going to do for this topic. They are treating it as a pilot program for them to learn from the experiences. So for this first RFP or request for proposals, we have $500 million. The price that the board members agree to set for this price or the payment amount is going to be $5 per carbon ton. The results must be expressed in carbon tons as in consistency with the UNFCCC rules. And they have this additional or possibility to access a 2.5% bonus payment for achieving maximum score on how countries are going to be using the money, and if they comply with the non-carbon benefits criteria that the board included in the decision. Well, one thing for you to know is when the countries were discussing on how to guarantee equitable access to these funds, there was a discussion on how to guarantee that no one single country will take all the funds available. So they decided to establish a country cap to promote this balance, which means that no single country can access more than 30% of the resources available. So this will guarantee that more countries can come forward and have the certainty that funds are going to be available for them to access them. The other interesting feature of this pilot program is the period of eligible results. This was also a very, very contentious issue. Developing countries wanted to get previous or past results, historic results to be recognized and paid for. But developed countries or donor countries were not sure that they wanted to recognize, or how far in the past they wanted to recognize these results. So at the end, I think they agree, or they reach a compromise position in which they are going to be paying some past results, but also require that the countries presenting a request for an application for the request of proposals will also have to demonstrate future results. So the period is a hybrid period. It will start or recognize results that are dating December 31st, 2013, and after that, and the period, the closing date for the period is December 31st, 2018. So pretty much those are the years in which countries can present their information and their application, their reference level to access the results-based payments. So if we can go to the next, I will just say that one positive thing of this issue with the period is that countries are receiving the incentive to really get more ambitious in the future and to keep getting results in terms of reducing emissions from deforestation. So we see that as a very positive development. So other highlights include that in terms of being eligible for the program, obviously countries that are applying will need to fulfill all the elements of the Warsaw Framework for REDD+. This is including the addressing and respecting the Cancun safeguards as an entry point, meaning that the proposals that that are submitted are going to be looked at with the lenses of the Warsaw Framework for REDD+ and make sure that countries are actually in compliance. Those countries that don't have all the requirements from the Warsaw Framework for REDD+ would not pass to the second stage, which is the evaluation stage. This is also the same for the GCF guidelines and procedures, which countries that are applying will also have to observe. This includes also the investment framework, performance management framework, and other relevant GCF guidelines. Now, once the countries have passed this first filter of eligibility, the proposals will be assessed through scorecard, which was also adopted in the meeting of the board and was attached to the decision. That scorecard contains different criteria under which the proposals are going to be weighted. The first filters, as I mentioned, the Warsaw Framework for REDD+ and some of the like standard GCF guidelines get a score of pass or not pass, whereas other criteria, for example, the ones that I was mentioning on non-carbon benefits, will have other kind of weighting in terms of numbers, 1, 2, or 3, depending on how the application or the proposal really meets the criteria in question. So that's a more sophisticated process to qualify the proposals, and I think we'll just have to wait and see how this plays up, because as we know, the Green Climate Fund has an international technical advisory panel which will be in charge of making some of the assessments from the proposals that are going to be submitted and compare it against the scorecard. Some of the parameters may be a little bit subjective, so this is something for us to keep an eye and understand how this will work in reality. But then one interesting condition or highlight from the decision states that the recipient countries, those that are finally selected to get the results-based payments, will commit and must commit to reinvest the proceeds. That means the payments that they will be receiving. Those resources will need to be reinvested in activities which are in line with either their national determined contributions, their national REDD strategies, their low carbon development plans, etc. So it's a requirement to keep reinvesting in this transition towards low carbon developments. And I think that's in line with the investment framework. It was a little bit tricky to apply the investment framework when we are talking about results-based payments, because these are activities that happen in the past. So the investment framework cannot be necessarily applied to things that happen in the past, but because the funds are going to be received, are coming from the fund, those need to be spent in alignment to these requirements and guidelines from the fund. So, and finally, I guess the last highlight I wanted to share with you is that for this first pilot program, the decision has been made that the emissions reductions that are going to be paid for are not going to be eligible for transference or to be used for any other purposes. The only purposes that can be pretty much these emissions reductions will have to be registered and cancelled. So any other purposes like using as offsets or transfer to other entities, these kind of transactions will not be allowed for this first pilot program. So finally, just to end the GCF update, just want to mention that this has been a very difficult process to get an agreement with these very, very polarized views that I was telling you some moments ago. But it really kind of completes the mandate from the UNFCCC in terms of operationalizing results-based payments. So this means that no, we're not expecting more guidelines or rules to happen in the near future in the UNFCCC or in the GCF in this area on the finance side of things. I think just want to also highlight that all these rules and this request for proposal, the terms of reference for the request of proposals that you will see soon, I guess, published in the GCF website, are really exclusively tackling phase 3 of REDD, or the results-based payments phase. But the GCF will have, I mean, it's also open for business in terms of having a project and program cycle that also contemplates payments for, support for forests in readiness activities or support for implementation activities. So just to highlight that this is only one piece of the puzzle. Okay, so with that, I think I'm going to finish the GCF section of the presentation, and we can go to the next slide, please. To now switch to COP23 and what is going to be happening this at the end of this year. As you know, the presidency for COP23 is Fiji. Although the COP is actually going to be celebrated in Bonn for different reasons in terms of resources and capacity. So for this COP, as is in a similar way than in Marrakech, there's no specific negotiations about forests that need to take place. We are right now waiting to see how the broader architecture of the Paris Agreement evolves, and how the Paris Agreement rule book take place more like at the general level. So then after that, we can understand what are the gaps or specific rules that may be needed for addressing the particularities of the forest and the land sector. So if we go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview or a refresher on where can we find forests in the Paris Agreement. For a more like detailed explanation of all these articles, you can revisit our post-Paris webinar, and you will find more details on all these articles. But I just wanted to give you an overview and a refresher on the main issues that came out of Paris for forests. First of all, obviously the most important is Article 5 of the Paris Agreement, which states that all parties should take action to conserve and enhance sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gases. And this article actually makes explicit reference to forests. It says including forests. It was a big win for the forest community to have the important role that forests play in the climate agenda recognized explicitly. And it also encourages parties to take action to implement and support REDD+, as well as joint mitigation and adaptation approaches. And it also, that article reaffirms the importance of non-carbon benefits in the whole process. That article also mentions explicitly the need to provide results-based payments as a key incentive for countries to keep moving forward to phase 3 of REDD+. And I guess the significance of the article is that it calls for all parties to take action on forests and land. That means that it's not only calling developing countries to take action, but all countries, developed and developing countries. That means that developed countries will also have to take action to protect northern and boreal forests. It also, the significance of this article is that at some point we were unsure of the continuation of REDD+ as an incentive mechanism beyond 2020. The majority of the multilateral funds available or the bilateral collaborations available were dated or were scheduled to end by 2020. So having forest and REDD+ enshrined in Article 5 gives that political signal of continuity and an incentive for countries to keep working in protecting and enhancing sinks and reservoirs. This, by the way, this article, I mean, talks about sinks and reservoirs, which is forest and land, but it also has a very important relevance for oceans. So anyway, these other articles that you see in your screen are articles that are, although they are not explicit to forest or don't mention explicitly forest, are pieces of the climate architecture that are going to be important or going to be related to the forest agenda in some ways. Article 3 and Article 4 has to do with the nationally determined contributions and the mitigation actions. So that has to do with how countries that have a high profile of emissions from the forest and land sector, how we can incentivize and work with them to include forest as part of this nationally determined contribution, making sure that forests are taken into consideration in their low carbon development strategies. In this particular COP, particular discussions are going to be taking place on NDCs and how countries should be submitting NDCs, for example, NDC features. And that's going to be an interesting discussion to follow. There are other interesting discussions that will take place, for example, on Article 6 under the Paris Agreement Working Group. Article 6 is actually under SOFSTA, which will have to keep working on the mandate to make recommendations on the Sustainable Development Mechanism. And one new acronym that you may have heard, it's the ITMOS, which are the internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. This Sustainable Development Mechanism discussions or the ITMOS discussion has to do with a potential market mechanism that could emerge for the new climate regime. We are, I think, still very, very far away to getting into an agreement. But one of the discussions that is starting to emerge slowly is whether forests should be part of this market mechanism or not. And then the ad hoc working group on the Paris Agreement will also continue discussions around the modalities, procedures, and guidelines for the transparency framework, which is this Article 13. And this is important because the transparency framework will dictate how countries need to be reporting in terms of action and support, how we are going to be putting in place mechanisms that will allow us to keep track of our progress towards meeting the Paris Agreement goals. And then I think finally, one of the key issues that is going to be under discussion for this COP, and I had said there's not going to be negotiations for forests, or at least that's the expectation. But the SBI, the subsidiary body for implementation, they do have a mandate that was established in Warsaw back in 2013 on pretty much revisit the focal points, REDD plus focal points voluntary meetings that had been taking place since Warsaw and until now. These meetings are annual meetings. The SBI needs to revisit if these meetings have been, what have been the results in terms of helping or having an impact in coordination of the support for REDD+, and assess if these meetings should continue or if there is a need to consider existing institutional arrangements or new potential governance alternatives for coordination of the support for the implementation of the REDD activities. So this is a mandate that comes from years ago, back in 2013, and the SBI will have to have these discussions in this meeting. Now, as you may have remembered, there were some proposals from different countries, in particular from the Coalition for Rainforest Nations, to create a REDD+ committee, similar in form to the adaptation committee, that may have a role in trying to coordinate the support for the implementation of REDD+. This proposal was in the table back in 2013. and it may emerge in this COP. We don't know. I haven't heard much about it. However, I think it may be something that we hear coming back. If that's the case, I think it's going to be interesting to understand what would be the added value of having such a REDD committee, as opposed to all the mechanisms that are already in place. Next slide, please. Okay, so in parallel, outside the negotiations, but in parallel to COP23, we are going to be seeing forests in the Global Climate Action Track. And as you may remember, may have heard before, this Global Climate Action comes from back in 2014 when the COP was happening in Lima. There was this need to bring non-state actors, or to find a way to connect non-state actors' efforts to the climate regime, to the UNFCCC negotiations, and to the new climate regime. So before it used to be called Lima Paris Action Agenda, then we have it evolved during time, and last year in Marrakech we had the launching of the Marrakech Partnership for Global Climate Action. Whatever is the name, I think the importance is to understand the objective, which is catalyze and support climate action by parties and non-party stakeholders in the period up to 2020. So this is what I was mentioning, how we can connect the efforts of other non-state actors to contribute to a higher ambition. So how can we develop a common vision to accelerate the action together? And normally, the Global Climate Action aims to convene state and non-state actors to promote more collaboration, to connect them, and to see opportunities to create more synergies and scale up collaboration. It has also the objective of showcasing success or actions that can promote greater ambition or inspire others to follow and to take action. And it also has another key objective, which is to report in terms of achievements and options to enhance action. And this is because the landscape of action is so fragmented and is so vast that we need to start creating some way to connect all this non-state actor action and to be able to understand if we are getting closer to meet the Paris goals, or we need more to do more. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, please. So this is I just wanted to give you an overview of what is happening this year in Bonn. As you can see in your screen, the Global Climate Action will have many thematic days. It's not only forest, but you can see energy, agriculture, transport, industry, etc. And there are these thematic days and also the high-level days in which they are talking or discussing more cross-cutting issues like finance, resilience, innovation. One key feature for this year's action agenda is that they are trying to create a more evident or more direct link with the Sustainable Development Goals. So you can see that there's some high-level events planned around SDG 11, which is about cities and human settlements, and also a high-level event on SDG 2, which is about ending hunger, achieving food security, and promote sustainable agriculture. So this is the program for this year's climate action agenda. As you can see there, the forest thematic day will take place on Sunday, November 12th. The whole day pretty much, and it's going to be focusing on understanding or communicating more about the forest and climate science. This year in particular has been a year in which we've seen tons of information on the science of forest and climate, sometimes contradictory. So there's going to be a forum on that. There's going to be a panel on progress in implementation with some countries and non-state actors sharing their experiences. There's going to be a discussion on enabling conditions needed to keep moving forward, including the Green Climate Fund presentation that will take place there. And then, of course, other non-state actors more related to the private sector talking about how they are taking action to take deforestation out of their supply chains. So this is the overview pretty much for the Forest Day. And we'll be there, whoever is going to be in Bonn and has passed to be in the side event zone. This is a free event and can be attended. Okay, so next slide, please, just to conclude. I guess one of the things that we need to understand and keep considering is that Paris was not the end of the road, and we need to keep working on continuation of both the momentum and commitment. There was a little bit of an impasse after Paris. We were all very happy that we had a climate agreement, but that was not the end of the road. And on the contrary, now we have to keep moving to maintain the momentum and the pressure, I will say, also in many state and non-state actors to actually take action and more ambitious commitments. We have seen in the past year, and I think in particular important for this COP, a stronger non-state actor leadership. I think this is fundamental to feed into the process for the 2018 facilitated dialogue, which, by the way, now the name of this dialogue is the Talanoa dialogue, under the leadership of the Fiji presidency, which will be clearly an opportunity to compare the national and the aggregate Paris Agreement targets and for us to understand if we are getting close or not really making any difference in terms of achieving the Paris goals. And then on this issue of state and non-state actors, I think what is important also is to know and to recognize that the governments are not the only ones that can resolve this issue. This is a huge challenge, and we need everybody to make their part, especially when we have political instability, as what we are having right now in terms of the U.S. government trying to disengage from the Paris Agreement, and how the private sector or and non-state actors, academia, scientists in the U.S. are taking on their hands to have this leadership in terms of climate action. So this is key, is crucial, and we hope that more momentum is built around this. So there's no excuse for governments not to take action. So yeah, we are not there yet. There's much to do. There's no time for lowering our guards. I think we have to accelerate action, and we have very little time for completing the Paris Agreement. So in general terms, not only for forests, but in general, the expectations for our expectations for this COP is to see clear progress in the pre-2020 action. We expect to have to see the launch of a robust roadmap for this facilitated dialogue, or the Talanoa dialogue, because so far we don't know what to expect for next year. And we also need to see as soon as possible Paris implementation guideline draft text. We know that obviously negotiators are not going to be able to finish the guidelines or the rule book for the Paris Agreement this COP, but it's important to see very, very solid progress towards next year. I think I'm going to end there, so we have some time to answer some of your questions.
Thank you, Josefina. So participants, you have been sending in your questions throughout the presentation, but now is your time. Make sure you send in anything that you would like, Josefina's expertise on. I'm going to start off with a question circling back to the GCF portion of this presentation about that a lot of these questions have been about the $500 million fund and sort of what is available and what's how people can access that. So can you tell us a little bit more about what kinds of programs or projects would be eligible to receive some of this $500 million funds for REDD+?
Sure, Emily, and thanks for that question, because I think I may have forgot to mention that this the access to these $500 million need to be via national governments. So the governments are the ones that are able to present the proposals in response to the request for proposals, and these are going to be interventions that are at the subnational or national level. So this is in consistency with the UNFCCC, meaning that countries, isolated projects or private projects, for this tranche, they won't be eligible. It has to be through the national government to make sure that everything is linked to national reference levels. And as I mentioned, maybe as an interim measure, subnational proposals can be submitted.
Great. And are there finance options for countries still in the readiness phase? I mean, you mentioned that there is some scope for emissions reductions that have taken place, through that December 31, I believe 2013 timeframe. But what about countries that are still working towards being able to prove that they have made these emissions reductions? What kind of options are eligible or are available for them?
So this presentation was focused mainly in this new decision on the 500 million for results-based payments. Now, it's true that many countries are not there yet in terms of being ready to demonstrate results in terms of reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, etc. So for those countries that are still not ready, there are other opportunities to access finance, including in the GCF, through the normal regular program and project cycle, where countries can submit their proposals to receive support to implement. So this would be support for phases 1 and 2 through the GCF. And of course, there's still some other multilateral alternatives via the Global Environmental Facility, the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, or through bilateral collaboration.
Great. And so all of these emissions reductions that are potentially being paid for through this GCF fund, because they can't they're non-transferable, right? So does that mean they only count towards a country's NDC, what they have outlined in their national plans?
For this first pilot program, it's going to be impossible to transfer these emission reductions. So that means that they will have to be canceled. The country can choose to use it towards meeting their NDC, that's allowed, but the country cannot transfer these emissions to another country or to another entity for the time being. I think this responds to the need to wait for the UNFCCC discussions to progress under the Article 5 Sustainable Development Mechanism and the ITMOS that we were just discussing a little bit ago. So waiting for the broader climate architecture to progress so we can understand how this will fit there. So I think that's why it's been decided like that. One other thing that I think I forgot to mention is, since this is a pilot program, the decision establishes that countries will have, the board members, will have to come back in 2019 and assess the progress and the quality of the proposals and the overall portfolio for this results-based payments phase, and to be able to make adjustments in terms of learning, new opportunities for a potential new request for proposals in the next period of time.
All right, and I think I'm going to shift to some questions we have about the UNFCCC process. So with the focus on global climate action and non-state actors and how important that is, can you give some examples of perhaps non-state actors that are really participating at a high level, or really working towards accelerating, kind of achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement?
Sure. There has been multiple efforts in the forest fronts. For example, since 2014, with the New York Declaration on Forest, where many companies, indigenous peoples groups came together and endorsed the declaration and set ambitious commitments. For example, in terms of private sector, there's companies that have committed to become DEF-free or to clean deforestation out of their supply chains by 2020. There you can see the list in the website of the New York Declaration, but there's many companies that are taking action and trying to understand what does it mean to become deforestation free, right? And it's not an easy task, but there has been some efforts, for example, to adopt sustainability standards or to be able to be more in control of the supply chain, understanding where are they sourcing from, because sometimes the big companies have a very fragmented supply chain and not necessarily have the capacity to trace down where are they sourcing from. So that's becoming more responsible about that and being able to understand where their inputs are coming from. It's a key issue, and at the same time making sure that also the benefits or of the operations are also reaching the right stakeholders. So it's being responsible in social and environmental terms. I hope that gives a little bit of an overview on what are we seeing in this non-state actor.
Great, thank you. Actually, I did have one more question about sort of the GCF process, or a few more questions. So if you don't mind, we'll circle back in that direction. But one of these questions is specifically about they're using an example of an afforestation project, and they're wondering if tree plantations and those kinds of processes are eligible for sustainability under these GCF funds. So I know that the difference between natural forests and tree plantations can be a contentious issue when you're working in this forest and climate space. Is there any guidance in this new GCF decision about sort of the types of forests that are eligible?
Thanks for that question. No, there is no guidance in the GCF at that level of detail. But what I can tell you is, again, as I was mentioning before, the projects cannot access finance directly through the GCF. It has to be the country that promotes this proposal to be submitted to the board, and the national designated authority needs to be on board working with an executing agency. So it's unfortunate, but yeah, there's no window for project level access to the GCF. Now, in terms of the plantations, I mean, it depends on national circumstances and why plantations are being promoted. Of course, for us in WWF, we always going to prefer to have natural forests rather than plantations, but we are also understanding that in some places plantations are meant to address deforestation as well when it's being used as a means to deter deforestation in different fronts. So it depends on national circumstances, but I mean, in terms of the GCF, I think if a country has included some reforestation projects or some reforestation programs as part of their REDD strategy or as a part of their overall national low carbon development strategy, my suggestion would be to get in touch with your government to try to understand what would be a potential role for this type of interventions in a potential submission to the GCF. And just to clarify also, these submissions that are expected to be received in the GCF are in alignment to the Warsaw Framework for REDD+. So that means that it's a subnational scale or national scale. So we are talking about very, very large scale interventions.
Great. You mentioned at one point that no one country can receive more than 30% of these total funds, but we have a question asking about sort of distribution based on continents. So is there any sort of guidelines about whether, any individual country can only receive 30%, but any continent or collection of countries in a particular region, is there a cap on how much can be distributed on that level?
No, not in this decision. There was no discussions. Well, I am pretty sure that there were discussions about this more regional equitable access, but the decision, as far as I understand, doesn't have any reference to this. And I think since this is a pilot and we have really a potential, very small potential number of countries that have complied with the Warsaw Framework for REDD+, I think for this first program may not be an issue, but it's something certainly to take into consideration for further requests of proposals in the future.
And sort of pivoting through to the future of this process, has there been any discussion about the next sort of block? We already have a question about, so then what's going to happen in January 2019? Is that going to be the decision? I mean, obviously it will be a decision of a future GCF board meeting, but have they given any indication of what kind of the next step might be after this period of 5 years is finished?
I think the expectation of both developing and developed countries is that this is not the only time that there would be results-based payments for REDD+. I think the intention is to test this approach and have the pilot program, and then obviously to have this moment of review in 2019 to understand how are we doing, how the portfolio is looking, and then my expectation, and I am pretty sure that the expectation of all the people that were engaged in the negotiations would be that there would be a next period for results-based payments. So if this works out well, I think, as I was mentioning, the devil is on the details on how the scorecard will be applied, and to guarantee that these are high quality programs, and that we are really seeing a shift by paying for results, that we are really having an impact in tackling deforestation and degradation. But nothing is written, so there's no guarantee that there will be a next period beyond this current 5-year period.
And we did have one question specifically about scorecards. Do we know who will be reviewing the scorecards? Will it be staff of the GCF, or will it be technical experts potentially from external organizations?
Yes, so as I was mentioning, there's a two-step approach. One is kind of like the first filter to understand if the country submitting is eligible or not. And that I believe that first filter is just going to be conducted by the GCF Secretariat. But then when the time comes to apply the scorecard, because there are some criteria that need to be weighted, I think that's going to be the international technical advisory panel that the GCF has. So the GCF has this roster of experts that help the Secretariat and the board review the proposals received to the fund, and they have to look at the proposals with different lenses and criteria and make sure that they comply with the GCF rules and guidelines. So this will be the same process for the results-based payments of REDD+. This international technical advisory panel will have to apply the scorecard, review the information, and produce a weight for the proposals.
Great. And participants, we do have a few more questions, or a few more minutes for questions. If you have any others you'd like to send, we're coming to the end of our list, and I want to make sure that if you have anything you want to ask, that we address it. I do have one question sort of circling back to COP23. Usually the level of participation on the part of the governments is the national level. Do you have any recommendations? We've got a question about any local government participants who are wanting to attend. So I'm not sure what level they mean by local, whether they're drilling really down to the local municipal city level. or if they mean sort of more regional representation. But are there sort of established channels for perhaps non-national level government participants to attend and participate in any of these UN processes?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I think there has been more and more presence of subnational governments in the COPs and in the discussions. I think there's been a recognition of the key role that subnational governments or local governments can play. In the forest and climate space, there's this Governors Climate and Forest Task Force that could be one important vehicle to get engaged if your government is signatory of this declaration, of the Rio Branco declaration of the task force. That may be something, if you are not, it may be something to consider joining and understanding and getting more information about it. Apart from that, in terms of access of support, I unfortunately don't have much information for the forest and climate space, but I'm pretty sure that there are other organizations that are working with subnational governments and maybe able to support. If we get any information, we are going to make sure to send it to you.
Thank you. And are there any countries that you know of that are making progress in implementing REDD+ that you're kind of excited to hear from at the COP? Or what things are you going to be looking out for while you are in Bonn?
I think I'm excited to hear about how countries are moving forward with their implementation plans. One in particular that may be interesting to hear from is the government of Ecuador, because it's the first country that access funds from the GCF, not for results-based payments, but to actually get the support to implement their national strategy. And I think they already got these funds a couple of years ago, so it would be a good moment for us to understand how these funds have made a difference and where are they at the implementation. There are other countries that may be interesting to follow on. The Democratic Republic of Congo, who is close in the process to access funds from the Carbon Fund to understand how are they, in what stage of the process are they, what is the next step for them to access or to sign the purchase agreement with the Carbon Fund, etc. So I think it's going to be an interesting COP in terms of having a lot of side events and opportunities to hear about implementation. And I think this is what we need right now to really know that countries are actually moving forward.
Great. Well, it looks like we've come. Looks like we've come to the end of our questions for today, so we can sign off a bit early unless anyone has any last-minute burning questions. There is one here. Can you address this very quick question? Is adaptation considered part of co-benefits?
I mean, for the GCF, I don't think it's framed in that way. I think it will depend on each country how they frame their proposals. But I can't recall that they were including adaptation explicitly in the discussion of co-benefits. And for the GCF, one key highlight or one important thing to know is that 50% of the resources of the fund need to be spent in adaptation. So this is by design. It's kind of like earmarked for adaptation, and then the other 50% is allocated for different things, including, for example, this new program on the results-based payments. So it will depend on each country how they frame their potential co-benefits, and I think to build the case on there.
Okay, thank you. And I will just say that stepping back, this has been a very finance-focused webinar today for obvious reasons. And the New York Declaration on Forests just released this morning their latest round of assessment reports that are focused on goals 8 and 9, which are specifically focused on finance for forests. So I highly recommend all of you, if you're interested in sort of the larger picture of forest climate finance and where it stands in the moment, those reports are very, very informative, and they provide a really good overall global picture. So it looks like we're finished with our questions today, so I will end us early. Jenny, if you don't mind, thank you. So we've come to the end of our time today. I really want to thank Josefina for sharing your expertise with our community. I know I always learn a lot about the whole process when I listen to you talk. And I want to thank all the participants for sending in your questions. You'll all receive a follow-up email in a few hours with some additional resources that are specific to this webinar, and I'll see if I can't sneak a link to the NYDF assessment reports in before it goes out as well. Next slide, please. If you want to revisit this webinar or share it with colleagues, the recording should be up later today on our Forest and Climate YouTube channel. And you can also find recordings of previous sessions there for additional enrichment, especially the one of our post-Paris webinar, where we really dove into each one of those articles and how they relate to sort of the forests and the global climate architecture. Next slide, please. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.